But to present the key findings from the analysis of the data, I now invite TIPNG's Deputy Director, Partnerships and Policy, Mr. Yuambari Haihuie, to give this presentation on behalf of TIPNG.
Excellent. Okay, good morning all. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is a presentation of the highlights of the report on the key areas that have been mentioned, and it will be an overview of the findings. It will not be an in-depth analysis of the data, but to give you a sense of what was observed by TIPNG. I'd like to thank all of you for making time to join in the room and also online for this presentation. It will also be shared after my presentation and during the course of the seminar. This outline of the presentation is really focused on, firstly, the observation process to explain how TIPNG conducted our observation, some of the challenges in terms of doing the observation, and then most importantly, the key findings. With this report, which will be released to you once we launch it on stage, we'll cover the following areas, looking at the political issues, which I'll go into some sample of the data that we've looked at, looking at administrative issues as well, social issues, governance challenges, and then an overall assessment of the quality of the elections from our observers. Towards the end, there's important recommendations that we've targeted towards the three actors to take forward. So that's the Parliamentary Committee, the PNG Electoral Commission, and the Interdepartmental Elections Committee. To start off with, I think it's important to outline what domestic election observation is and what TIPNG's domestic election observation look like. Observation is a process done in support by the Electoral Commission, where organizations can accredit, individuals can accredit to conduct observation within terms of reference of observation. TIPNG has done this since 2007, so this is our fourth consecutive domestic election observation, and we've done this with partnership with the Electoral Commission. To recruit our observers, we undertook an expression of interest. In previous elections, we've done it with individual observers. So those that have been interested in the elections have come forward, and we've really worked with our members. So membership with TIPNG also entails the opportunity to participate in observation. And for those in the room and those watching online, I also encourage you to sign up to be members of TIPNG to support this process. In addition to members, we also worked with organizations. So for this elections 2022, because of the preparedness that would be required to undertake this activity, and because of the nature of the elections project that we had, we were looking at elections integrity in partnership. And so we wanted to work with organizational partners across the country. So we sent expression of interest forms to those organizational partners. They sent in the individuals within their organization that could observe. And so we worked with them to run the trainings within their provinces. So up here I have a photo of our communications Deputy Director Yvonne running a training session in Milne Bay with the PNG Australia Alumni Association Milne Bay chapter. This training was done using PNG EC materials, so there's materials that have been provided by the Information and Civic Awareness Branch within PNG EC, and also some of TIPNG's materials. And we look specifically at how observers could go out and collect data. As mentioned by Aaron and Mr. Kasman, this is also an important awareness activity. So beyond just elections observation, it speaks to TIPNG's mandate of trying to empower Papua New Guineans during the electoral process to take action against corruption. The thinking is that obviously if our observers are trained and they are aware of the processes and the expectations of an election, then they're also better able to engage with that process. And so informing observers is a part of awareness as well. In terms of the reach, so the data was collected from all 4 regions, as mentioned, across 20 provinces. We were not able to get into Gulf and Hela, but we were able to do the other 20 provinces. Up on the screen is a graphic of the provinces we went to and the partners in each of the provinces, as well as the districts that we went and observed in. Again, as mentioned by my colleagues, we've had 340 volunteer observers. I think that was probably the largest domestic election observer group. We worked with 20 partner organizations across 20 provinces in all 4 regions. And the total of the data sampled is from 578 polling places that we observed. And so we had aimed for at least 5% of the total polling sites in country. We had 2,184 voters that were interviewed for the voter survey component of this observation. So in terms of the data collection method, the two survey instruments that we used, the primary one is the polling place questionnaire, and it has 45 questions. So that's the one to the left of the screen, where we give to our observers in a manual, and they note the setup, coordination, and delivery of elections at the polling place. So TIPNG's observation is focused specifically during the polling period. We do not observe the pre-elections period, the nomination campaign period, or the counting period directly. They obviously inform our observation, but the specific tools that we've developed are for the polling process. The other tool that was used was the voter survey. The voter survey had a set of 5 questions looking at issues that occur and that might impact voters' ability, impact the fairness of the elections as perceived by the voters. So this was asked of voters after they had cast their vote. And just to flag in terms of the data analysts out there in the room, the limitation for this particular activity, in addition to the logistical challenges of getting the information on time to be able to allocate personnel to the correct polling sites. So for instance, the polling schedule came out the week of prior to the polling. It made it difficult to coordinate in a more geographically diverse manner than we would like. And then having said that, this data is also not representative of the country, it's representative of the polling sites that we observed. So while we can speak to the data of the polling sites that we observe, they might not necessarily represent the conduct of elections in the country. So it's a specific data set that we're looking at. So into the findings, within the report that we'll be launching this morning, there's several chapters that we look at the data. The first is looking at the political, second social, then governance, and an overall assessment of the elections. Previous reports, we had just put in the data as per the questionnaire that we had, and we felt that this time, because there was a reform process being undertaken, it would be good to structure them in a way that could inform reform process. I think the first area that we looked at was political leadership, and it's covered within the report. We flagged areas of concern about political support to the elections themselves, particularly remarks by political leaders, party leaders, head of government, head of opposition, prior to the elections about the importance of the elections. This was something that was not as forthcoming as previous elections, and we flagged concerns around political leadership on the importance of elections. We also flagged the concern around allocation of funding. So the funding for the election process, rather than coming in 2021 for the preparation for the elections, came in 2022, and so it impacted a lot of the preparatory work that was required. The appointment of the electoral commissioner to the office also came late in the electoral process, towards September of 2021. So that also impacted administrative components. We flag these issues in particular because they have a political dimension to them. So the budgetary process is set by the politicians, and likewise with the appointments committee for the electoral commissioner. There were obviously legal issues on dates and declarations, and this discussed extensively in the document around the special circumstances for declarations, as well as the extensions in accordance with the Constitution. And we also discussed media freedom within the political analysis section of the report. In terms of the data, so the administrative findings are some of the key areas we looked at. The respondents that we had from our polling place questionnaire. One of the key issues that the media covered in the lead up and during the elections was names on the roll and the roll update process. Within the report, we discussed the roll update process extensively, but one of the key data sets I wanted to show you was looking at people who claimed that the name was not on the roll even though they had been there in that area for a number of years or at least voted in the past election. So if you see on the graph, we had 12% say very many times this occurred, where someone would come up to the polling booth, say that they had lived in this area, they had voted previously, but their name was not on the roll. And in 34% of the cases, it happened many times. So that's almost the majority of instances, and a few times takes it over to close to 70%. So again, this is concerning, and this data that we've collected from our polling place questionnaire gives evidence to this. We were able to also look at the specific regional breakdown of this polling question of people being on the roll at polling sites, and you'll see that there's a marked difference between the regions that we have. On the graph, you can see the Highlands region having many times more cases of people going up to the polling place and not having their name on the roll, at least as observed by our polling place observers. This is in comparison to the other provinces, the other regions. So with New Guinea Islands faring the best, and the Mamasa and Southern. So this regional analysis of the election trends also speaks to some of the differences that we've seen in terms of the administration issues within the elections, with some regions having more preparedness or able to adjust to late preparedness, and others not being able to adjust as quickly. So this is really concerning in terms of the regional analysis, and I want to point to the Highlands regional analysis because it shows people coming up and saying their name was not on the roll, but then when we look at, again, roll analysis, was the roll used? So this is in distinction to if your name is on the roll, was the roll used at the polling places that we observed? And then conversely, you will see that for the other regions, they're quite highly used. And then for the Highlands, even though they have a higher proportionality of people whose names are not on the roll and saying that at the polling place, even in that instance, they still don't have the roll being used in those polling places that we observed in the Highlands. And this is, again, a concern in terms of the trends that we've observed, and this regional analysis speaks to that. The analysis that we have in the report goes into much more detail in terms of what the issues were in terms of the roll. We looked at checking for ink, checking for voter IDs prior to voting. We also looked at the polling place setup, whether equipment, booths, posters were available. We looked at the ballot account forms, so these are the forms that keep track of how many ballots have been allocated. We looked at whether unused ballots were declared and shown to be unused at the end of the polling day. And we also looked at the transportation of the ballot boxes as well, whether they were secured and what the transportation arrangements were after they had been used at the polling site. As a general observation, we found that most of the trends in the 2012 and 2017 elections administration reports, election reports by TIPNG carried forward into this election. So these issues around the use of the roll, the people's names being on the roll have carried forward. There hasn't been any substantive action to address those roles since those issues since the last election. The next area that we looked at was grouped into social issues. Obviously, TIPNG's mission is to empower people to take action against corruption during the elections. And so we were particularly interested in bribery and intimidation of voters. So I'll draw your attention again to the results that we had, with 68% of our observers at the polling places in the Highlands saying that they saw bribery and intimidation of voters. This is again distinct from the other regions, with the New Guinea Islands only at 17%, Momase at 25%, and Southern at 16%. So these are the observation of whether people were intimidated or bribed at the polling area on the day of polling. And again, we can look at this across regions, and this particular bribery and intimidation question that was in our polling place observation was also in our voter survey tool. So the voter survey is the tool that we use to interview voters after they've voted. The polling place questionnaire only looks at our own 340 observers' impressions of what was conducted at the polling place. So this question around bribery and intimidation made up a set of 5 questions that we asked voters after they had voted. And so we saw these regional trends as well. So the first question that we looked at was people were offered or asked for a bribe if they voted for a particular candidate. So this was the response that we got nationally. And you would see that 50% of respondents in our voter survey said that they saw this happen sometimes. This is bribery and intimidation. And then it increases with many times and nearly always being 23% and 13%. And that's just on bribery. The second column, if you come in from the left, we asked if voters were threatened if they did not vote for a particular candidate. And this happens sometimes 60% in the totality of the polling places that we observed. Again, 62% for secrecy, if people were able to vote secretly. This was a question that we asked voters, and they said in 62% of the instances, sometimes they were able to vote, but in other instances, they were not able to vote secretly. And then lastly, in terms of administration, we also asked voters, people cannot vote because polling officials are not ready. So this is a question looking at preparedness. And we asked, were people disenfranchised because of the lack of preparation by electoral officials, either a late start or some other issue? And this happened nearly always in 3% of the polling places we observed. 6% many times it happened. And again, 31% sometimes. So these are still concerning statistics around the administration of the elections as perceived by the voters. While we have 43% saying never, this is the national figure. Again, when we look at the regional analysis, we have the regions faring differently. So I'll remind you, this is the national figure across those 5 issues, and then this is the figure for the Highlands region. So for Highlands region, the frequency of sometimes and nearly always increases substantially. That's the blue part at the top of the graph. And that's across the 5 areas that we asked in terms of bribery, intimidation, for the ability to vote in secret, and the other issues that we've highlighted. So we've grouped this under the social issues and are discussed in length within the report. And just for comparison, some other regions like New Guinea Islands, you have never happening 60% of the time. For bribery, 77%. So these are saying it never happened at the polling places that we observed by voters' perception of the process. So when we interviewed the voters, in the New Guinea Islands region, for instance, 60% of them said that, 64% said that people were never offered a bribe. 77% said people were not threatened at the polling place. 78% said people were able to vote in secret voting. So you can see there's regional variance in terms of the data that we've collected. So the regional variation is also explored fully in the report. It might seem like a gloomy outlook in terms of people's participation, but we're also looking at interesting trends that might come up in terms of reforms that are being proposed or considered. And one of the key relationships that we found was in terms of women's participation in the elections. This graph that I have here is looking at the impact of separate polling places and separate polling booths and queues for women voters. So you have, on the left, you have instances where polling booths or entrances were not there for women, and you saw substantially less free election outcomes for the women voters. When separate queues were there, we saw more free elections for women voters, as observed in our polling place questionnaire. There was a direct relationship between whether women who had access to their own separate polling line and their own separate booth felt that the elections were more free at their polling station. And this again speaks to some of the reforms that were introduced, because this was a deliberate administrative decision by the Electoral Commission to give express lane across the country for different voters. So this express lane was used for women voters, but also persons living with disability, mothers, the elderly, and it increased participation. So this kind of analysis is also possible with the data, looking at what are the reforms that are possible based on which processes might strengthen the ability of people to participate. The social issues section of the report is the most extensive. It looks at issues of vote appropriation, so using someone else's ballot paper to vote. It looks at block voting, secrecy of the vote. The photo I have up here is of a polling station in the Highlands where the polling official is being intimidated by the group of men there to fill out ballot papers for the aim of block voting. We look also at the secrecy of the vote, to what extent polling places had compartments so that voters could vote secretly. Assisted voting, so that's for persons living with disability and for those that are unable to read and write. We looked again in depth at rights of women voters, bribery and intimidation, and the impartiality of polling officials. So whether polling officials were bribed or intimidated during the conduct of elections. This is also explored in detail in the report. The next big area that we looked at was around governance. And so apart from polling officials, we also looked at security personnel. So this is whether police and any other security personnel deemed to be impartial or fair. So this is the national result. You'll see that in 38% of the polling sites that we observed that, the observers noted that polling security personnel were impartial or fair. But then in the majority of instances, they felt that security personnel were not impartial or fair. So that's 30% for sometimes, 13% for mostly, and 14% for always. So in the majority of instances across the polling places that we observed, our observers noted that police and security personnel were not impartial or fair. Again, we can do regional analysis on this particular result. This time you'll see that for Islands, Momase, and Southern, they said that the security personnel were impartial or fair for 45% of the time, 40% of the time, and 38% of the time always. Whereas in the Highlands, they said the security personnel were only impartial or fair for only 20% of the polling sites that were observed. So again, this is pointing towards trends around the differences in terms of security personnel who are independent of the Electoral Commission. Also, their conduct varies across the regions, and this is analyzed further in the report. In the report, we show data on accessibility. This is under the governance challenges, accessibility of polling sites. So this is in relation to base votes. The selection of polling sites is a key political maneuver in terms of establishing a base vote to retain a seat. We also looked at taking away of ballot boxes during polling, so whether it was due to weather or due to some other administrative issue, or whether because of violence that occurred at the polling site. We looked again at the impartiality of security personnel and the coercion of voters to vote for a single candidate. So this is again, in this photo in the Highlands, we have security personnel towards the side of the polling station, watching on as voters fill in the ballot papers at that polling site. So these are explored within the governance challenges. Towards the end of the report, within the findings section, we also look at the overall assessment of the conduct of elections in Papua New Guinea in 2022. And so this is the overall national findings of whether our observers thought that the polling process on the day that they observed polling was very fair. So you'd see that 48% said that it was very fair. But then you have, 48%, 23% said it was very fair, and all the processes were followed. That's only in a quarter of the polling places that we observed that. And for the majority of the polling places that we had, it was less than very fair. So they're mostly fair, with some processes not followed, which was the largest proportion at 48%. But then you had a sizable proportion of polling stations saying it was mostly unfair at 10%, and an 8.9% saying very unfair. And that was an overall assessment taking into account the totality of the 45 questions looking at the polling place conduct. Again, we can look at the regional analysis on this, on voters and what they felt in terms of the fairness of the polling processes on the day. You can see for Southern, it's 24% said it was very fair, 27% for Momase said very fair, and 23% for the Islands said very fair, whereas 13% for the Highlands region. And then the majority, again, in each of the regions, slightly less than very fair, with most saying mostly fair. But you'll note in the Highlands, it's not mostly fair, that's the second, not the highest, but actually very unfair. With the process, mostly unfair, with the processes not being followed. So that's the analysis in the report, and it's an extensive report looking at a large data set. And we look at, in this section on overall assessment, how scrutiny has also participated and how observers participated, and what the reception from the public was in terms of scrutineers, observers, and the response from the voters. As I come towards the end of the presentation and analysis, we do have extensive recommendations for the three agencies I mentioned. The PNG Electoral Commission as perhaps the most extensive, and we've in the report divided them between integrity and transparency recommendations. These are some of the transparency recommendations. A key interventions that could be undertaken over the next 5 years to strengthen the outcome of the 2027 elections. It's particularly around dissemination of information. So with a communication strategy, using digital platform to ensure information is given out, engaging with stakeholders and partners to disseminate information, working with the provinces to make sure information goes out, having set procedures and processes that are publicly available that can be used by electoral officials but also the public, and to have a clear outcome of what should be expected in terms of the electoral conduct. So making sure that that's also communicated clearly for all stakeholders to be aware of. We look at integrity recommendations as well, and these are all structured within the report. Looking at the complaints process, we recommend having MOUs between the Electoral Commission and the police, for instance, so that clear responsibilities are outlined, but also looking at the Independent Commission Against Corruption and making sure that that link is there for the 2027 elections as well. We look at integrity strengthening by working with the courts in terms of the processes, and then we look at also how they can be engaged for work by the Electoral Advisory Committee at least a year before the conduct of elections. These are integrity recommendations to the PNGEC. For the Parliamentary Committee, we recommend against for transparency, supporting the PNGEC's effort to do full report to Parliament and make that report publicly available. We recommend looking at legislating the requirements for electoral roll information to be made publicly available, and to ensure that consultation, once it's started, is again publicly available for as much input from citizens as possible. In terms of integrity recommendations to the Parliamentary Committee, we're looking at strengthening mechanisms within the Electoral Commission to provide accountability at decision points. For instance, by expanding the number of commissioners within the Electoral Commission, looking at the accountability mechanisms within the Electoral Commission so that it is more independent of the government of the day, and to align the organic law on national and local government elections with new anti-corruption laws that have come in, notably the Whistleblower Act, as well as the organic law on the Independent Commission Against Corruption. So where there have been legislative developments that might strengthen integrity, the Parliamentary Committee, as it pursues its reform, should incorporate that into the work of the Electoral Commission and the reforms that are being pursued. There's also amendments to the organic law on integrity of political parties and candidates. So in the Parliamentary Committee's work, we also would encourage them to support those amendments that are coming through that particular legislation as well. For the Interdepartmental Electoral Committee, the key recommendation is around the commitment to a 5-year budget to support the activities. So the budget that just come out yesterday, I haven't had the chance to look through and see what the allocation for the electoral processes are. But it's important that the administration, government, and the public service coordinate to assist the Independent Electoral Commission to fulfill its functions. We also have a strong recommendation on provincial electoral steering committees. So this is a mechanism in the provincial level where coordination and administration support can be given to the Electoral Commission. So these are the key recommendations given to each of the partners. And we also say that the PESC can be a mechanism of strengthening accountability within the provinces. So to promote integrity, and these are the integrity recommendations I have up on screen. They could be used to look at recruitment of temporary electoral workers, that's TEWs. And the IDEC can also look at how coordination of toll-free access. So you had a Joint Security Task Force toll-free number that was available. You also had the Department of Justice have its own toll-free. There might be a consolidated toll-free service that could provide information to voters during the elections. So the report recommendations are divided into those 3 components, looking at transparency and integrity recommendations, and then dividing them amongst the respective agencies. So the Parliament with the parliamentary review, the Electoral Commission with its own processes, and then the IDEC as the administrative support from government. That brings me to an end in terms of my presentation. I think the key conclusion is that we've collected the data. It identifies several deficiencies, but it's important to use these deficiencies and the data that's been made available by TIPNG to inform reform processes. Often when we go into the elections, we have maybe our own preconceived notions of issues. And so this data set, we're hoping, informs some of those discussions and provides a basis for some of the interventions that are being pursued by the Electoral Commission and the Parliamentary Committee, as well as the IDEC. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Yua. So you've now heard our key findings and our key recommendations for TIPNG's Election Observation Report 2022.